Washington Talk, I'm Eun Cho. President Trump and Chairman Kim met at the inter-Korean border in a quickly arranged meeting. President Trump became the first sitting U.S. president to step into North Korea. Will the historic meeting lead to real progress on denuclearization?
Across that line was a great honor. A lot of progress has been made. A lot of friendships have been made.
거치 않은 그 과거를 청산하고 앞으로 좋은 밤날을 개척하려는 그 대통령이 그 남다른 용단의
In the studio with me today, Ms. Soo Kim, analyst at the RAND Corporation. She previously was a CIA North Korea analyst focusing on the regime's leadership, nuclear proliferation, and propaganda. Also joining me, Mr. Gause, the director of CNA's Adversary Analytics Program. Mr. Gause focused his research on the North Korean leadership for the last 30 years and has written 3 books on this subject. Welcome to the program.
Nice to be here.
Now, Mr. Gause, let me begin with you. President Trump and Chairman Kim strolled down into the North Korean territory. What do you think was the significance of the latest meeting at the DMZ?
Well, it signals an opportunity for the two countries to explore ways of getting the negotiations and engagement back on track, which have kind of gone off the track since Hanoi. But it's really going to come down to what each side is willing to put on the table, and we'll see what they are able to kind of work out over the next several weeks or months.
Mm-hmm. How did you see the meeting?
Well, it was, I think, for many people a surprise that after 32 hours of sending the tweet, he was able to meet with the North Korean leader, and then it produced almost an hour-long meeting. But at the end of the day, it produced little in terms of substance. So all we got out of it was working-level talks. That was supposed to be part of any sort of agreement process between the two countries to begin with. So at the end of the day, the question remains, what is going to happen to denuclearization? And really, are we actually getting North Korea to the point where it's going to dismantle its nuclear weapons facilities?
Mm-hmm. We'll get to that point later in the program. So why do you think Kim Jong-un rushed to the DMZ upon last-minute notice?
I don't think he necessarily rushed. I think you had the exchange of the 2 letters between Kim and President Trump. And I think that North Korea was sensing that President Trump might want to look for an opportunity for a meeting when he came to Asia. And so they were paying very close attention to his statements and his Twitter feed, and they were prepared very quickly to move out once he made the offer.
Mm-hmm. And Ms. Kim, so this meeting at the DMZ lasted 50 minutes, and after that meeting, North Korea agreed to come back to the working level talks and even agreed to sit down with Secretary Pompeo, which North Korea previously demanded exclusion from the talks. So what do you think happened, and do you think President Trump offered something new to Chairman Kim?
Well, I think time will tell exactly what happened. We haven't really gotten a readout from the meeting, but we have to assume that this was not just going to be a free-for-all meeting for North Korea. It was, at least appearance-wise, it was a last-minute attempt. I think the protocol and preparation suggests that there was a little bit of time in between to get this through, but they could talk about how much they want certain people on their negotiating team, but at the end of the day, it's going to be Kim Jong-un wants to deal with President Trump, and that's it.
Mm-hmm. And Ms. Kim, do you think the North Korean propaganda machine will exploit this meeting?
So that's a really interesting question, because I was actually thinking about the optics of it, and we have to look at it, I think, also from the aspect that we actually gave North Korea an opportunity to maximize the utility of this meeting, because we agreed, or we invited North Korea to this meeting, but North Korean propaganda is hailing this as a success, saying that it was an amazing event. And you have to wonder, why was it so amazing? Did something go on behind the scenes between President Trump and Kim Jong-un where we don't really know exactly what happened? But we have to see it as, North Korea is going to picture this and pitch this as the US president really wanted to meet with Kim Jong-un, and Kim Jong-un relented, took his time off to meet with the US president, and nothing came out of it.
And Mr. Gause, the New York Times reports that the United States has moved the goalpost to only now go for the freezing of the North Korean nuclear programs. Do you think this is the case, or is still the ultimate goal the final and fully verified denuclearization? Do you sense any softening of U.S. stance?
I think that there is probably a debate about strategy toward North Korea going on within the administration. There's obviously John Bolton takes a more hawkish point of view and takes a more hardline point of view. But as you know, probably noticed, he was not at the DMZ meeting. He was in Mongolia. Whereas Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner were at the meeting. And the last time we saw Ivanka Trump as related to the North Korea issue was during the Olympics. That could be signaling that there is a softening of the U.S. strategic approach toward North Korea going on. We'll have to see. But as far as the fully verified and irreversible denuclearization, I think that's still the goal. The question is, will it remain the upfront goal as it is in the Bolton plan, or are they going to move it further down the line and add more flexibility into the U.S. strategy?
Mm-hmm. Do you sense any softening of the stance, and do you think there is a split within the U.S. administration on North Korea policy?
So we saw the New York Times article where they speculated that the United States administration might be willing to consider a nuclear freeze. From my perspective, I think that whether or not this was hearsay, I think the fact that this discourse, it's entering into the conversation of elites, suggests that the administration is actually coming to terms with the fact that we can't bring North Korea to denuclearization within this administration, within the next however many years. It might take 5 years, it might take 10 years, it might take decades. So that's the reality, and I think that having to come to some sort of an agreement has been pushing at least Washington to work on this timeline, and I think that's where we are right now, where we're finding ourselves in a position where we're forced to come up with something, and there's nothing really at the working level to support that.
Mm-hmm. Do you think this is the way to go? Do you think the United States needs to first go for the freezing of North Korean nuclear programs first?
I've long been an advocate that the way of dealing with the North Korean program is to try to freeze it, put it in a box. It is not a full-up program. There are various steps that would need to be taken, testing that would need to be done in order to have a full-up program. If you can put that in a box for a while and then have a phased reciprocal process, which includes sanctions relief, to try to get further parts of the program dismantled. And then we'll work down the line. But to expect North Korea to fully give up their nuclear program anytime soon is probably not going to happen. The trust is not there on either side.
Mm-hmm. And Ms. Kim, prior to the Hanoi summit, the working level talks only served to set up the logistics. So how can we learn lessons from that experience and make this a more meaningful one?
At the end of the day, I think the question we need to ask is, where are we with North Korea? Does the United States actually have a strategy, top-down strategy, where they actually have something broad and that's trickling down to the working level? And we're not seeing that right now because there's this inconsistency between the White House and the working level officials. So you hear one thing from President Trump, there was tweets. So we have this tweet rhetoric that sort of dictates where policy is going to go. But then at the end of the day, the broader concern is that we still have the nuclear missile threats that are still looming around. And there's nothing really that we've had to really peg the North Koreans down to take action. So I think instead of looking at it from the perspective of what can we do, or what's next when it comes to dealing with North Korea, is really to look at what have we done with our own strategy to make it coherent, to make it more a whole of government approach, and we haven't really seen that yet. So I think this is a time for us not to rush into anything, but to also really think about at what point are we going to continue and to stop doing these negotiations, going into diplomacy without really knowing what diplomacy really is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And President Trump hinted that sanctions easing could come during negotiations. Mm-hmm. So for North Korea to earn that, what does North Korea have to bring to the table?
Well, I think North Korea is going to have to put, obviously, more than what they offered in Hanoi, more than just Yongbyon. They're going to have to put other elements of the nuclear program, probably the ICBM program, on the table. But the U.S. is also going to have to figure out what they're willing to put on because humanitarian aid and people-to-people contact, which is what Began has kind of floated, will not get any movement by North Korea on their nuclear program. They're going to have to put some sanctions relief.
And Ms. Kim, the latest development is that U.S. sent letters to the UN member nations to send back North Korean workers according to the international sanctions. And North Korea was adamant, and North Korea issued a statement saying that United States is hell-bent on hostile activity against North Korea. So do you think the latest incident would have negative impact on the upcoming working level talks?
I see this as just part of North Korea's overall strategy of, dangling carrots, saying that they're willing to talk, and they're willing to conduct diplomacy, and then threatening the United States with consequences if they don't obey North Korea's commands. So, we can't expect talks with North Korea from this point to be smooth, and this is just part of what North Korea is trying to do to intimidate us, to bring us to the point where we slowly bend and become more malleable to North Korea's demands.
And President Moon said that after the DMZ meeting, U.S.-North Korea hostility has ended. Do you think the latest meeting is tantamount to the ending of the hostility, or what would be the prerequisite?
Absolutely not. This is a process. It's a long process. Maybe when we get around to having a peace treaty signed, then we can say the ending of hostilities, but that's a long way off. This is a one step in a long road that we're looking down toward hopefully profitable engagement on both sides.
And Ms. Kim, President Moon waited outside while President Trump and Chairman Kim were having their meeting at the DMZ. So what is the symbolism here?
This is really reflective of the whole negotiation process. Any process that involves denuclearization, whether that's North Korea or the Korean Peninsula, must involve South Korea as an interested party. What we saw at the DMZ was the South Koreans making accommodations. So you're providing the hotel service for President Trump and Kim Jong-un to meet. It was pretty much a thankless job where he wanted to participate. I heard that he even wanted to suggest trilateral talks, and that was dismissed by the administration. So that shows that South Korea serves as a very useful tool for the North Koreans to use when it needs to sort of add catalyst, when it needs to sort of get the United States to take some sort of action. But that's probably as far as it's going to go. And the concern here is that, let's say that, it's not just about sanctions, but it's about, signing that peace treaty. Then South Korea must be at the table to have a say. And if we're not really considering that side, that other factor, then where does that put the future of the peninsula?
And Mr. Gause, looking forward, do you think, how does U.S. elections play into the denuclearization talks? And would North Korea try to slow walk the negotiations or try to make some tangible results soon?
Well, I think that as we approach November 2020, President Trump is going to become more and more focused on domestic politics and campaigning for president. North Korea is looking to get their whatever they can in terms of secured sanctions relief or whatever locked in early enough. Because another president is elected, obviously, very good possibility that whatever agreement is reached with President Trump could fall apart, that sanctions could be snapped back on. So I think that Kim will go as fast or as slow as he needs to get what he is looking for.
And Ms. Kim, President Trump invited Chairman Kim to come to the White House for the fourth summit at the White House. What would be the interest of the United States and North Korea to have that meeting?
From the U.S. perspective, I think it really ties in with President Trump's campaign goals. Let's say that he needs that extra boost, and there's really no criticism to face with this North Korea policy. He could use that as an example to say, look, we've solved the North Korean nuclear problem. There have been no missile tests. There have been no nuclear tests for the past 18 months or so. So I've solved it. Nobody else has done this before. So this will be another way to boost his standing. For North Korea, there's really nothing to lose. I mean, you essentially keep your nuclear weapons. You get to meet with the head of state of the most powerful country in the world, without really lifting a finger. And then you also get to have security around you. You perpetuate this notion that you're a reasonable human being who wants to take care of your nuclear weapons program in a very safe manner. So it's going to be a win for Kim.
Well, we'll end our conversation here and now watch video for our next discussion.
Because over the next 2 or 3 weeks, the teams are going to start working to see whether or not they can do something.
The North Korean diplomats are taking over the negotiations with the United States. The previous team, led by the United Front Department, has been sidelined after the collapse of the Hanoi summit. Now, Ms. Kim, the transition from the United Front Department to the Foreign Ministry, what are the implications to the negotiations?
Well, I think that if we were to go to the nitty-gritty, there's going to be obviously differences in the personnel and the personalities, but at the end of the day, it's Kim who still holds power. He's the one who calls the shots. So from my perspective, I think that the fixation that we have on the leadership reshuffling and the moving around of the pieces on Pyongyang's chessboard, it's only valid in assessing the tactical changes of North Korea, but we have to come to the reality these days that the strategy for North Korea hasn't changed. So the more we spend time trying to calibrate that as opposed to looking at where we are with North Korea and how much progress we've made on the denuclearization question, I think that's more important.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Gause, who are the major influencers behind the negotiations in North Korea?
Well, I think that behind the scenes as strategists would be Cho Son-hui, the first vice foreign minister, who's also a member of the State Affairs Commission. She has been a long time watcher of U.S. affairs, headed up the America Department within their Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Probably knows the U.S. positions as well, if not better, than our own negotiators. She has an encyclopedic memory of past negotiations. Other people would still be people like Kim Yong-chol, who, while he has kind of stepped behind the scenes, I think still plays a role in terms of how to think about laying out a strategy vis-a-vis the United States. On the front end, in terms of the people who will actually engage, we have now started to see the increasing role of Yi Young-ho, who's the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He will be Secretary of Pompeo's opposite number. He and Pompeo will probably sit above the negotiations, but they provide the channels back to the principals, Trump and Kim. And then you have Kim Yong-gil, who now appears to be the Steve Biegun's opposite number, former ambassador to Vietnam, but also somebody who sat on the America desk within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, former deputy chief of mission at the UN, somebody that the U.S. negotiators will be familiar with, and somebody who has participated in negotiations with the United States before on nuclear issues.
So, Ms. Kim, Secretary Pompeo and Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho, are they just in the background, or are they just shadows, or are they really actively involved in the negotiations?
Again, I think this has to do with the leadership style of both countries. We've seen that both in the case of North Korea and also in the United States, it's a very top-down approach. So we know that Pompeo and Ri Yong-ho are going to be at the forefront of anything that's public. At the same time, I think also the question that, whoever's going to be remaining in the shadows, the thing is, North Korea is not going to deal with just anyone. They call the shots. So if they don't want to deal with Pompeo, they're going to make it known in their rhetoric, in however way, shape, or form. I don't think that option is readily available for the United States. We are basically taking whoever they give us. And I don't know if that's because, for efficiency's sake, or if it's because of cultural differences. But at the same time, I think that's also a very striking observation because, we're always so curious about who's going to be dealing with a U.S. representative. And I'm sure the North Koreans, as Ken mentioned, they know so much more about the United States than sometimes that we know about ourselves. And that has to be something that we have to kind of think about when we deal with the North Koreans, is that the tables are always turning in their favor and not in our favor.
I think one thing that Sue was getting at there, which I think is also important, is the fact that they are putting people in position of these negotiations. These are not decision makers. They will operate within certain boundaries, off of certain talking points. That gives Kim a lot more control over these negotiations. And we have to understand that. We can put things on the table, but doesn't necessarily mean that they can make a decision on the spot. They'll have to take it back and discuss it and figure out how they're going to react to it.
So I wanted to follow up with you because you mentioned Kim Young-chul as a strategist behind the scenes. There were much reporting about Kim Young-chul, Kim Hyuk-chul, and the translator, and people at the United Front Department being purged. So are they still not purged and still working in the ministry?
No, we tend to make a lot out of these replacements of North Koreans. Sometimes there are purges, obviously. This is a very brutal dictatorship. But in this case, I think, yes, there may be some re-education going on, especially with Kim Hyuk-chul, especially with the translator that was involved and had some mistakes that were made in the translations in Hanoi. And we obviously see a different translator that was at the DMZ. But I think that when you look at the leadership lineup that came out of the leadership meetings in April, we see, Kim Young-chul still holding on to his positions, senior level positions within the leadership, although he's no longer the head of the United Front Department. We have now seen Kim Yo-chong, Kim Jong-un's sister, being seen publicly. She's going to play a prominent role. So to say that there are purges going on, I think is an overstatement. It is something that sometimes North Korea will use as disinformation to cause dissension within South Korea. We have seen that before, and that may very well have been the case here.
Well, we have so much to talk about. We'll have to leave it here and move on to our next segment. Now, time for the photo moment. Time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today, we have a cartoon by the Radio Free Asia on the DMZ meeting by President Trump and Chairman Kim. The title is One Small Step for Me. And RFA notes, President Trump becomes the first U.S. president to set foot in North Korea 50 years after Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon. Sue, what's your reaction?
Well, I think the quote, "That's one small step for me," it's really an understatement. Yes, it was a physical stepping over of the DMZ line, but it also symbolizes just how far the U.S. is willing to go when it comes to getting some sort of a deal with North Korea. That could be denuclearization, that could be a freeze, that could be something else. And that's because the North Korean image that it perpetuates seems to be working to its favor. And you saw that, once again, Kim Jong-un didn't have to lift a finger, and this meeting happened. And now we're in a position where we want to get working level talks back on track. And again, the thing is, where does this end?
Ken?
I think this really paints very well that President Trump is an unconventional president. And North Korea understands that. They understand that they're not going to get a deal where they're going to get things that they want from a conventional president. That didn't happen under President Obama, President Bush. I mean, it really has not been something that they can manage to extract out of the United States. But with President Trump, they see the possibility, but they also know that potentially they only have a limited amount of time, which then will go into North Korea's calculus on how they want to play the next few steps.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Gause, Ms. Kim, thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun-jang Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.